and okay, we'll wait. Now I can say good evening. Good evening and welcome to this Holberg Prize event, the Holberg Laureate Live. And my name is Kjersti Frøttum and I'm chair of the Holberg board. A special welcome to the 2023 Holberg Laureate, Professor Joan Martinez-Alier, and to Professor Mariel Aguilar-Støen. In a few minutes, they will have a conversation here tonight, this evening, on the theme Social Metabolism, Ecological Distribution Conflicts, and Valuation Contests in the environmental justice movements arising worldwide. So, about the Holberg Prize. The Holberg Prize was established by the Norwegian Parliament in 2003. So this year we are delighted to also celebrate the 20-year anniversary of the prize. And the prize is administered by the University of Bergen on behalf of the Norwegian Ministry of Education and Research. And we have just ended the Holberg Week in Bergen with celebrations, many celebrations, and numerous academic events in honor of the 2023 laureates. The Holberg Prize is intended to increase society's awareness of the importance of research in the humanities, social sciences, law, and theology. And every year, the prize is awarded to an outstanding scholar within the research areas covered by the prize, either within one discipline or through interdisciplinary work. And this year, on the recommendation of the Holberg Committee, the board of the Holberg Prize has decided that the Holberg Prize goes to Professor Joan Martinez-Alier from Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. In addition, the Niels Klim Prize is awarded annually to a young researcher under 35 years of age from or in another country. And this year, the Niels Klim Prize goes to literature researcher Simona Zetterberg-Nielsen from Aarhus University, Denmark. I would also like to mention briefly two more initiatives established by the Holberg Prize. First, the Holberg Prize School Program, which is an annual research competition for students in the upper secondary schools in Norway, and where the three top contributions are awarded prizes. Second, we also host and organize the Holberg Debate, an annual event inspired by Ludwig Holberg's Enlightenment ideas, aiming to explore pressing issues of our time. Now, as mentioned, this year's Holberg Prize laureate is Joan Martinez-Alier, who is Professor Emeritus at the Environmental Science and Technology Institute of Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. He is also Professor Emeritus at Latin American Social Sciences Institute, Flaxo, in Quito. His research focuses on ecological economics, political ecology, agrarian studies, environmental justice, and the environmentalism of the poor and the indigenous. And in 2016, he was awarded a European Research Council Advance Grant for the project A Global Environmental Justice Movement that went from 2016 to 21. Martinez-Alier is also a co-founder of the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice. And based on this atlas, Martinez-Alier has a new book coming out this year, actually in press. That is the volume Land, Water, Air, and Freedom, the Making of World Movements for Environmental Justice. Now, this book will analyze hundreds of ecological distribution conflicts and the valuation languages displayed by poor and indigenous activists. So, to the conversation partner of Professor Martinez-Alier today. The conversation partner will be Mariel Aguilar-Støen, who is Professor of Human Geography at the Center for Development and the Environment, that I know as the SUM Center, at the University of Oslo, where she leads a research group, among other things, Rural Transformations. Her research has focused on agrarian change in various parts of the world, including countries in Latin America. Currently, she leads a research project focusing on avian flu and its impact on social and political relations in agrarian societies in Norway and Denmark. Aguilar-Støen has published 3 books and numerous academic papers dealing with socio-environmental conflicts related to extractive industries, tourism development, and forestry, as well as on the role of elites in environmental governance. Professor Aguilar-Støen has also worked with Professor Martinez-Alier on one of his research projects, and she is also very familiar with the Environmental Science and Technology Institute of Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, which Martinez-Alier co-founded. So I think that these connections between Aguilar-Støen and Martinez-Alier bodes well for an interesting conversation. So please, Mariel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Kjersti. Joan, what a pleasure to have you here, and what a privilege to be able to have a conversation with you. I will start by mentioning you started your career at the University of Barcelona as an economist. Later, you went to Oxford and became an agrarian economist. You have on several occasions mentioned that your position was then closer to Marxism, but open to other influences, including Polanyi, anthropology. And there's a book that was published this year that is called the Barcelona School of Ecological Economics and Political Ecology, a companion in honor of Joan Martinez-Alier, that is edited by 2 former students of you, Sergio Villamayor and Roldan Muradain. And your colleagues made a video to promote this book, and they mentioned very nice things about you. But there are 2 things that they repeated: anarchist and activist. And another thing that was mentioned in this video is liberation theology. And there's no doubt that you are a strong proponent of interdisciplinarity, and you have influenced many disciplines, including my own discipline of geography, anthropology, environmental studies, etc. Could you tell me from your perspective, what have been the major influences that have shaped your scholarship and your thought through the years?
Well, obviously, I myself have had some confusions in my mind in political over the years, or my students, former students, because being a Marxist and an anarchist is not so common. And also, what does anarchist mean? Well, I was born in Barcelona in '39, where the anarchists already had been defeated twice, one in '37 by the communists or by the Stalinists, not by some other Marxists. Inside the Civil War, inside the Republican side, if you have read George Orwell, this is explained, or if you have seen this film by Ken Loach, with an interesting title for our conversation, because it's called in Spanish Tierra y Libertad, Land and Freedom, and he explains these fights inside the Republican side. I was not born yet. I was born in '39, where things got even worse, because Franco took Barcelona on the 26th of January, and I was born, they tell me, I don't remember very well, on the 6th of June of the same year. My parents have, although they were not at all sort of anarchist working class, they were sort of middle class, and had stayed in Barcelona or in Catalonia during the Civil War, while other relatives went away because they were more bourgeois upper class and had to leave. Well, as in any family, there were all kinds of people, but this was my main influence for a very long time. The political situation in Catalonia, in Spain, with Franco, who was like a sort, well, the other day I said, was a kind of Kisling in the sense of a collaborator with fascism, not only collaborator, a promoter of fascism, but he was successful for 35 years. So here it was much shorter, isn't it? You had 5 years in Norway of more or less. So anyway, this was really a very bad period for Spain in my view. I went to university, I did economics. I was lucky to have a group of friends of my age at the time, of 18, 19 years, all including, for instance, although I didn't know him yet, Manuel Castells, who also got a Holberg Prize and a Balsam Prize, and who went to exile to Paris a bit earlier than they left, because he's a bit younger, and he immediately worked with Turenne, the sociologist, and he's really genius. And he wrote this book, The Urban Question, when he must have been 27, 28. Well, I wrote my own book about Spain, published in 68, because after doing economics, I wanted to do agricultural economics, so this was one reason, and the other was really the atmosphere in Spain in 61, 62, which is when I finished my degree in economics. And I wanted to leave, and I left, and I went 1 year. I was lucky, I could go 1 year in Oxford to the Institute of Agricultural Economics, and there I saw on the wall an advertisement. One has to look at the walls, the graffiti in the walls, isn't it? An advertisement from the Rockefeller Foundation. So I had an early interest in oil, it seems, to go to Stanford to do like a master in food nutrition, the economics of food nutrition, which is important for my later life, because there I learned about, immediately when I was 22, 23, about calories, kilocalories that we need. Now I know it's 10 megajoules per day if you are eating 2,400 kilocalories. And this is what we call endosomatic energy. This I learned a bit later. But I learned about protein and calories. I was joking the other day that the first day in the course, a very good teacher, he told us, you have to calculate a diet sufficient for your calorie and protein, forget the vitamins because it's too complicated, or minimum cost. And it consisted in eating peanut butter, which was something which I didn't know from Barcelona, because I don't recommend this for other reasons, but but it was. So with linear programming, it was a technique, mathematical technique for calculating this minimum cost sufficient. Well, perhaps this is relevant today for the degrowth movement, isn't it? Try to eat less, but also sufficiently. I am not sure what would be the best diet. Probably less cholesterol, but it was 1 year, and then I was lucky again, and I found they gave me a scholarship to go back to Oxford, which was where I wanted to go, to St. Anthony's College, which is a college which is going on now. It's more international relations, and then it was a lot of contemporary history. For 3 years, at about, remember the amount was like 700 pounds per year at the time. This, you can notice that I have become a grandfather and explain these stories. In my time, I could live with 700 pounds per year. To do research in southern Spain, to study the lack of land reform or the counter, and because what happened in Spain and southern Spain mainly was that the Republican side in the Republican time had tried to do land reform against the big land holdings. And this is from Jaén, Córdoba, Sevilla, not in Eastern Andalusia. And they were doing to Extremadura also, they were going to do this. And the workers were really agitating, and then Franco did the coup d'etat, I think, partly because of this reason. Also against scattering independence, Basque independence, to defend the Catholic Church, and so on. So at the time, theory of liberation did not yet exist by far. Anyway, so I wrote this book, which is called in English, Laborers and Landowners in Southern Spain. And then, because they became a specialist more in agrarian politics and sociology than economics at the time, I went 1 year to Cuba, and then from Oxford. All this was paid by English gold, which was not very abundant. And then 2 years to Peru, where in Peru, Velasco Alvarado had the military from the sort of progressive nationalist military had also done a coup, but in favor, more or less, of the land reform and the poor, and the land reform started. I don't know whether it's the kind of thing you want me to explain my life, but in Peru I really learned new things, very new things, because we, with other people, including Eric Hobson, he came, and he was of course already well known and established. We went to the Tribunal of Agrarian Justice, where there had been formed with a jury, somebody from the judicial career. The military put him, Guillermo Figalo, and he wrote to us a letter saying, you are allowed to travel and go to the former large haciendas, large meaning 100,000 hectares in the Sierra. So sheep farming, big haciendas, very big. There was nothing like this in southern Spain, 100,000. Some of them belonging to the Cerro de Pasco Copper Corporation, a mining company, and some to a local kind of bourgeoisie in Lima who had bought these haciendas, which, well, as you know, I mean, the Spanish gave the encomiendas, then they became haciendas. The limits of this, whatever said in the registry of property or the notaries had written about, all this was fictitious. We had now these 3 days in Bergen with this Simone literary person who got the Niels Klim Prize, and she's specializing on fiction and facts and fiction in literature. So the haciendas in Peru were totally a mixture of fiction and facts. What was a fact was the abuse against the Indian workers who had to work there or who were expelled from the haciendas, back to the communities where all the sheep and llamas and alpacas and so on. And they didn't want to leave. They wanted to take over the haciendas and things. But in literature, there are these novels by Manuel Scorza from the time and so on. So I never seen a situation that we could document. I wrote a short book called Los Huaxilleros del Perú at the time, which became part of another book called Haciendas, and Plantations and Collective Farm, with things from Peru and from Cuba, Latin American struggles. And then, well, these haciendas, what happened is that were expropriated, but because the people, what they wanted is to stay there, to take them over, with a mixture of, so to speak, class conflict, obviously, between peasants, communal peasants, communities, and the large land owners who lived in Lima or in New York, the Cerro de Pasco Corporation. And there was a lot of correspondence in these haciendas that had been expropriated from one day to the next, they were left behind, and many other kinds of books of accountants and so on. So I was quite instrumental in putting this in lorries and taking lorries to Lima, which I don't know whether it's a good thing because Lima has a very bad climate for paper, but anyway. And we formed the Archivo Agrario, which is in not a very good state right now, but it exists. And it was preserved. For instance, Laive, which is a famous hacienda at 4,000 meters near Huancayo. I was myself there packing the papers for a lorry, because by letter of permission to do this, to this archive, which Pablo Macera, the historian, gave a building of the San Marcos. I haven't spent this so often and so long forever, everything. And Laive, like this was 71, 72. In 1980s, Sendero Luminoso, which was real madness, started, and at the end they took up these haciendas near Huancayo, including Laive, and they burned everything. Could remain they would burn the papers. And these papers were, and in these papers there were correspondence between the administrators of the haciendas and the owners in Lima, because there were no phones yet in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and but they were writing a lot, explaining that the Indians, los indios van a invadir, in this terminology, we have to do so. Please tell the governor to send some military to protect that. It was really a kind of well, I was very involved in this emotionally also, because it was the defense of the indigenous people speaking some dialects of Quechua, Huanca, which I didn't understand, but who really had been protagonists of this fight. Hobson wrote an article in Past and Present called Land Invasions, based on these papers. And I wrote this small book, and other people wrote doctoral theses or master theses based on this archive that we formed, El Archivo Agrario Busco. So because of this, this was what, 70-something, and Franco was about to die, but he took a long time, so I didn't know what to do. And then in 73, my fellowship in Oxford more or less was finishing, and Franco was more or less dying, but not quite. And so in 75, I went to Paris for some long periods because there was a publisher called Ruedo Ibérico, founded by anarchists. Was my influence of anarchists comes from this for Ruedo Ibérico in Paris, exiles from the Civil War in 39, and who founded in the 60s this publishing house to print forbidden books in Spain of contemporary history or anything, which would not exist, isn't it? Would go through the waves through internet probably. I don't know what happens in places where books are forbidden. So this is the end of my career as an agrarian study expert in Latin America and about to become an ecological economist.
Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
No.
since you mentioned, there are two things that you mentioned now. This is the end of your, as agrarian economist, and it's the start of the new. And then we have talked about ICTA. It's been mentioned several times during this week, and you funded the PhD program at ICTA. And in your own description of the formation of this program, you mentioned that it was several dissidents that came together, both ecologists and economists. But the program was never established at the Department of Economics, but first at Geography and then at ICTA. So what would you say are the main points of disagreements between orthodox economy and ecological economics? And why are environmental economists not the same as ecological economists?
Yes. So the ICTA and so on, this doctoral program was founded in 97, and I had already become a professor of economic history in institutions in 75, 76, when Franco had finally died. And the university started to improve, and there was, anyway. And from until 90s, I didn't teach in environmental sciences because there was no degree in environmental studies in the university. And we started in 92. And in 97 is when we started to have this doctoral program in ecological economics that was took refuge in the Department of Geography because the economists, it was not a big fight, you know, many of you, if you are in universities, there are all the time these little fights, which is not very important, but, well, which stop things from improving. Isn't it? It's the main reason of university bureaucrats to stop knowledge, in a way, new knowledge. And so geography, as in other places, was very, David Sauri, he had done a doctorate in Clark University in the States, and he was more aware of this, and that's what we did. But on this issue, the dissident economy, ecological economics started to work in the 80s. And in my experience, a lot in Sweden with Anne-Marie Jansson, Carl Folke, who was his student, and other people. and also, of course, some people from the States, some people, other people from Central Europe, and there were some of them were ecologists, like Anne-Marie Johnson herself. She had studied with H.T. Odum, Howard Odum, and she was like an systems ecology, studying flows of energy. And she wrote a book with somebody else on flows of energy in the economy or in the society of Gotland Island, which is in Sweden towards the east, which is not a small island. But so these people, like Bob Costanza himself, they were studying flows of energy, but not just in lakes and with animals and plants, but also in human society. Some ecological anthropologists like Rory Rappaport in '68 had published a big book, and very impressive book. I think it's a really good book about a group of people called the Sembaga Maring in New Guinea, and he studied the flows of energy, but studying the food system, isn't it? So I knew about this already in theory. But the food system in calories and protein and so on, in a small group of people, as a good anthropologist, he spent, I don't know, 1 year, 2 years there, and then he wrote this book, which is called Pigs for the Ancestors. Not pigs for selling, but pigs for subsistence. But anyway, explaining the religion and explaining the economy and explaining the ecology of this region and these people. So these were like ecological anthropologists also in Peru, like John Murrah and other people explaining exchanges between ecological pisos, ecological heights. No? For instance, in the Andes, whereas in any big mountain, meat and milk and cheese and so on, and wool, no, come down from the high Andes, 4,000, 5,000 meters in Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia. Down, they have to come down where there are other people. These other people are cultivating maize, perhaps, no? And even down below, there are people growing coca, and the coca has to go up, and so this kind of exchanges without money in pre-conquest time, and even now in barter markets, but they are not markets with money. This was something that ecology had to explain also, isn't it? But it was ecology and economy. So these are the ecologists or environmental historians already, perhaps, or anthropologists on the one hand, and the other were economists like many Georgescu Reagan or Kenneth Boulding in the States, who said, well, to cut it short, I mean, Georgescu Reagan wrote a book in '71 called The Entropy Law and the Economic Process. He was, before that, he was a very good neoclassical economist, but also he had written about peasant economists because he had this Romanian background. And this book in '71, Georgescu Reagan, '68, Roy Rappaport. These were big influence from the point of view of the literature. We are in the house of literature. What do we read? And I read these books, and Georgescu Reagan was quite difficult because he went a lot on the history of thermodynamics and so on. But I trusted him because he had written all these very good articles already about peasant economics and so on. And I met him. He came to Barcelona for a week or so, much later in '79, 1980. And so in '85, '86, '87, we founded the International Society for Ecological Economics with dissident economists, Herman Daly, who died recently, and this kind of systems ecologists who got interested in the human species professionally, because ecologists from Haeckel onwards, they were studying plants and animals, but not humans. No? I always joke that they left the humans for the weekend or for dinner time or for the night, I suppose, but not for Sundays, but not for working days. But this is not true. From the 70s, 80s, David Pimentel in Cornell, for instance, he started to write these articles about how modern agriculture in Iowa, Illinois, maize agriculture, with maize, corn. He showed that corn grown in the US style was less efficient energetically that corn grow in Mexico or Guatemala in the milpa system, doing all the accounts in material, the energy and material terms about the nutrients and so on. Well, this was really a surprise as an ecological, no, as an agricultural economist, that I had been, that one could show, not with money accounting, but with energy accounting, that this kind of old agriculture was more efficient than the modern one. Mm. Of course, it's not only the energy, it's also the preservation of the seeds and the, well, the flow of nitrogen in la milpa, for instance, well, that you know because you are from Guatemala. It was invented in Guatemala, this, and southern Mexico before your time, no? About 5,000 years before your time, but it was invented. So this is how I became an ecological economist, but it's not me. I am like second or third generation. If one counts George Escurregen, who was born in 1910 or so, 1906, and precursors. And then he wrote a book about these precursors of ecological economics. And the book is called Ecological Economics, Energy, Environment and Society. And it's the first book, it seems, published with the title Ecological Economics. I say it seems because one thinks sometimes that one has discovered ideas and then one finds that somebody has discovered them before. This happens in history of science continuously. And this book was what launched me as an ecological economist, but also with, not in Barcelona, but outside in the States and in Northern Europe, in Sweden and in other places, that we were a group. We did a conference in Barcelona in 87, but then one bigger conference in Washington in 1990 with Bob Costanza was in the lead organization this. And well, we were, I don't know, 400 people. And the next conference of the International Society was in Stockholm, and the third was in Costa Rica with Figueres as president. And people were coming from the street into the conference to learn what was ecological economics, because it was new at the time. And we never got on together very well with the environmental economists. Because the environmental economics is like transport economics or agricultural economics or urban. It's an application of the principles of economic theory, which come from the analysis of prices and markets, isn't it? And from Balras and from the neoclassical economics, or Adam Smith also 200 years before, studying the division of labor and the growth of the economy with economic reasoning. This is what economics is about. And what we were doing was not this kind of economics. It was about studying energy flows, material flows, the metabolism, isn't it? And also, well, I can explain a bit more what we do in ecological economics. And the others, no, what they do is really the application of orthodox economics to any issue. Could be the marriage market, or could be as there are books like this, or could be, and they do this a lot now in the last 30, 40 years with game theories. So there is some overlap, but ecological economics is wider, and as we always say, is a field of study, a transdisciplinary field of study. It's not a sub-discipline. It's not a discipline. It's a field of study. That's the difference.
And I'm wondering about another thing, and this that in Europe there are many ongoing discussions, and particularly in this part of the world, as I said, on the so-called circular economy as a way to deal with climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And the EU adopted a Circular Economy Action Plan in March 2020, and I'm going to quote, "As one of the building blocks of the European Green Deal, Europe's new agenda for sustainable growth, the EU's transition to a circular economy will reduce pressure on natural resources and will create sustainable growth and jobs." The new action plan announces initiatives along the entire life cycle of products. It targets how products are designed, promotes circular economy processes, encourages sustainable consumption, and aims to ensure that waste is prevented and the resources used are kept in the EU economy for as long as possible. This end of quotation. But then insights from ecological economics will suggest that under current circumstances, such circular economy is impossible. Do you agree, and could you explain why?
Totally impossible. I mean, if you go back to the title of Georgescu Regen's book, which is called The Entropy Law and the Economic Process, and his main point is say that the industrial economy is based for the energy sources on coal, oil, and gas, isn't it, which are fossil fuels. And when you all know this, if we burn a ton of coal, we cannot burn it again. The energy, the heat, has been used perhaps in a steam engine to move a train in the 18th century, or for instance, you can do electricity, by burning the coal and then with a turbine with the steam, but you cannot. I mean, there is no method to resurrect the coal, isn't it? This coal has become, the energy has been dissipated, and this has been studied under the name the second law of thermodynamics since the 19th century, and the word entropy was introduced by Clausius in 1880, 65, something like this. So the second law of thermodynamics was introduced in 1850, This is interesting because it already was working, but nobody had given it this name, isn't it? Of thermodynamics. The dynamics means Kraft, perhaps in Norwegian, force in German, Kraft, and dynamics, and the thermo means heat, and how these things can be brought together into an interpretation. So the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy law, shows clearly that a circular economy does not exist. An industrial circular economy based on fossil fuels is not, cannot be circular. It is entropic. So we are not only in the era of the Anthropocene, we are in the era, if you would like to look for more names. Well, some people say the Capitalocene or the Plantation, but I would call it the Anthropocene, Entropy, from entropy, Anthropocene. I have not invented this, the Anthropocene. If I have invented something, I will tell you, but not now, will come later. But what I mean, if we are in the Anthropocene, there is no circular economy. Before the European Commission, in China, 2005 or so, they had a law of the circular economy. The economy of China is going to become circular. China every year takes 4 billion tons of coal and burns it, right? For more or less. It's still going up a little bit. This means about 3 tons per capita of coal for the Chinese economy. Well, there is no, it's not circular. It's not moving to circularity. Now there are statistics or research by the Vienna people of Marina Fischer-Kowalski, people who have been doing studies of social metabolism, quantifying this for 20, 30 years, and they show that in the world economy, we every year now, after the pandemic, about 1,000 million tons of, 100 milliarden, you say, 100,000 million tons, that's 12 tons per person, if we are 8 billion people in the world. So this amount of materials enters into the economy. A lot of it is for cement, is sand and gravel, but also biomass, also metals, and also the fossil fuels. Of these, less than 10% is recycled, mainly metals are recycled. All the rest, you have to go again next year. The extractivist industries, state-owned or private, they have to go and extract again the same amount or a little bit more next year, because the amount of last year has already become buildings or has been burned as fossil fuels or has been used for animals, if it is biomass, animals for producing meat or milk for humans and so on. So only 8% actually. So there is an enormous, people call this the circularity gap, no? Could be called the metabolic gap or rift or whatever word you want to use to explain this, that the economy is so. To say that the European law or directive is going to promote the circular economy is just, if we say fact and fiction, is one of the clearest fiction. I call this litanies. Litanies like in the church, like Ave Maria Purissima or Ora Pro Nobis. So there are sustainable development, Ora Pro Nobis. Sustainable development goals, Kyrie eleison. Well, these are kind of Catholic jokes, and you are supposed to be strong Protestants here, most of the audience, but you see what I mean. Litanies. They try to be performative litanies, isn't it? Performative words, and are going to produce realities. Well, they can produce at least some research projects. This is true, this is good. So, for instance, all of us in the ICTA in Barcelona, we don't believe in the circular economy. I understand Jason Hickel is coming to Oslo soon. Well, ask him also.
So there's no... Yeah, I will.
This is very important, because since the economy is not circular, it is entropic, there is this continuous march to the commodity extraction frontiers, meaning nickel, copper. Where is this conflict in...
Lithium.
In Norway, of the Nussir company in Ripert, what's the place? Ripert Fjord, isn't it? Thank you. And they won, the company won, isn't it? And the environment lost, or the local people lost in this case, I think, because they got permission to take the copper. But why should they go to take the copper in a place where people are objecting, or nickel in other places now, or coal or gas, or oil in the Lofoten Islands, for instance? And why do they are not bad people, I mean, they are normal people, normal capitalists, but sometimes they are even, like in Russia, state companies. Because, precisely this, you need new, even a non-growing economy, because of the entropy hole would need new materials, new energy every, I say year, but it's not every year, it's every week or every month, isn't it? Because the other one is already in buildings for 200 years, already. Well, it's very obvious that this is how it works. But at the so we link ecological economics, the study of social metabolism, with political ecology, because political ecology studies these kind of conflicts.
Yeah, and I was wondering about something in relation to that, because you have already mentioned your experience in Peru, Cuba, Ecuador. It was, I guess, a very exciting time. And resistance related to extractivism have increased, as you have mentioned. We see that this resistance has extended to communities like the Sami in Sweden and Norway, and the indigenous of Dakota, and other communities that are not geographically located in the so-called South. And that brought you to write about this, your thesis of the environmentalism of the poor, yes, which is a very different type of environmentalism, yes, other environmentalisms. But what I have been wondering is that you call these new ecological distribution conflicts. currently arising around the world that you have been studying. But what makes these conflicts new? Or is it just conceptualization as ecological distribution conflicts that is new? Because if we think about colonial times, there were also conflicts related to extraction. So what's new?
The word ecological distribution conflicts is new, but the issue is not new. Like political ecology is also a new term. Even the word ecology is new is a certain a neologism that Haeckel, I think, introduced, or entropy. These are new words, but all things that happen. But this is like an excuse, because what you're asking is more how did we know, how we did not perceive this kind of conflicts before so much in writing social history or in any kind of study of the past, isn't it? And I think, for instance, when I was in Peru, this I explained in the early 70s, I was looking at these peasants and these hacienda conflicts, but very near in central Peru, there was La Oroya, which was a famous refinery from the central Peru, from the company called Central Peru Copper Corporation of New York, that made the railway to take the copper out, isn't it? And the Oroya refinery was polluting a lot with arsenic and sulfur dioxide, as happens with copper, as happens with nickel refineries in Kirkenes here, coming from Russia, isn't it, as I understand. So the refineries of metals are quite polluted. Well, this was not only, it was not a mystery. You just had to go to La Oroya in the road to Huancayo. I don't know whether any Peruvian in the audience, to smell it. I don't know whether we were smelling arsenic or what we were, I hope not. But we were smelling the sulfur dioxide very clearly, and the color, the yellow color. So why the study of environmental conflicts on pollution and also on the exhaustion of resources has not been studied before. And in my experience, I realized this already late. I mean, in 88, I was invited to go to India to a meeting of ecologists, scientific ecologists and activists in Bangalore. And they met Ramachandra Guha, who was writing his thesis was finished, and he was publishing, but not yet publishing, this book that he published about the Chipko movement. And I read it in draft still. And this book explains how in the Himalaya, this was not new either. In fact, his book makes the point that it was new. It's an environmental movement, but not new. But how can you have an environmental movement in the 70s, which is not new, when nobody was talking about environmental movements before? But he says, well, before even the time of the Chipko movement in the 70s, the British had nationalized the forest in India, and the people were complaining, and they were changing some forests into other kind of trees for the railways in India, and the people were complaining and so on. And they were burning the pines, for instance, no? He says in the Himalayas there are sheer and the other oaks. And the people wanted the oaks because they were using the oaks, cutting a little bit for the cattle and so on. So this book influenced me and many other people a lot, and also the author himself, and we are friends in 88 when we met first in Bangalore. And he founded like South Asia environmental history. And this was, and a couple of years later, we thought together that we should call this the environmentalists of the poor, and again going to Peru, there were people more or less already working on this, including Hugo Blanco, the peasant activist who is still alive. And at the time he was a senator. He's been in jail many times. At the time he was a senator, and he wrote an article with this title that somebody told him to do, The Environmentalists of the Poor. Say, to the Senate continuously arrives complaints from Bamarca in Cajamarca, from Campo Grande, in the conflicts which are still alive, about water and land, no? Water, land, and depriving the freedom of the people to use the land and the water and the clean air by mining industries. And this title of this article, which we use, and I translated it for Goa, is called The Environmentalists of the Poor. So this is how it started, a mixture of activism, a mixture of traveling and reading newspapers. And then one realized that there is, and this was a polemic, the environmentalists of the poor, this is from 1991, against a great figure in political science called Ronald Inglehart, who had written these books about cultural change in Europe or the US after 68, saying after 68, the main issue was no longer the social question of wages and salaries or the working class conflict that had created the Labour Party in Norway, I'm sure, and in Sweden and so on. But it was something different. Some young people started to think of, he says, the self-expression, personal autonomy, and they are not worried about economy, material issues, because they already are rich enough. She doesn't say rich enough because of the oil, cheap oil. This was the main reason. It was not Keynesian social democracy that made the economy grow. It was cheap oil from Arabia. And then he said this, and if you read him even now, it's quite convincing in a way, because for instance, it's like talking about myself in a way. Once you don't have to worry about going to a factory at 6 o'clock in the morning and making a pittance and so on, you can start thinking and become, and you can go for music or you can go for other things for the environment. Or feminists, he also explains this, feminism becomes important, which is another big mistake because feminism is much older thing, isn't it? So, but Ronald Inglehart thought that his empirical sources and many followers were doing surveys, asking people, do you care about the environment? You can go and see the questions. Would you prefer more money or more environment? Or what do you think of the whales? Where I'm here paraphrasing and making a joke out of it, but it's more serious than this. And then he concluded that these people were more environmentally inclined, isn't it? And this Guan and myself, we have called them the cult of wilderness. When people are rich and so on, they worry about, in his case, of course, tigers in India and the elephant, and forget about the people. And we thought, no, there is another kind of environmentalists, which is the environmentalists of the poor, and I call it now environmentalists of the poor and the indigenous, like the Samis, for instance, where the main language of the protest is identity. It's not so much that we are poor, it's also we are poor, relatively poor, but also indigenous territorial rights and so on. As also Adivasis in India right now, in Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand, fighting against Adani and the coal mining industry. So there are more and more examples and more people killed in acting as in their own interests and because of their own values, cultural values also, defending the environment when there are these conflicts. In fact, there is a recent article published from MICTA by Senia Hanasik, who is here, and Dalena Tran, who is now in the States, which I don't remember the title, but is about women environmental defenders killed that we have in the Aldas. And they have collected like 81 cases of women, and then they said there are many that we don't know the names, therefore we are not in the list. But with the names and the circumstances, and you all will remember Berta Cáceres, but perhaps not Gloria Capitan in Philippines, or Teresa Navacilla in the Philippines, or Fikile Natsangase in South Africa, all women, they are environmentalists in practice, not in theory, isn't it? Defending something.
And I was I think that, okay, this is this fight for environmental justice that you have also been writing a lot about. But I really want to talk about the growth, so I'm just going to if we can very briefly discuss this issue. The Earth Fund, this is an NGO that Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, created in 2020, and he committed $10 billion to be disbursed as grants to address climate and nature issues within the current decade. And one of these funds program is called environmental justice. And the justification of the program within the fund is stated as, and I quote, "The positive links between meeting climate, nature, and justice objectives are undeniable. Those least responsible for causing damage suffer most from it. Frontline communities are also powerful agents of change." The Bezos Earth Fund partners with communities, coalitions, and initiatives that explicitly address these inequalities, end of quotation. The program has allocated $300 million to 43 grants to projects in the Congo, the Andes, and Black communities in the US to support environmental justice. So it's, to me, this is just one example of philanthropic organizations incorporating environmental justice within their portfolios. There are other examples. But what do you think about this? Does this mean that the environmental justice movements are having an impact on policies of philanthropic organizations? Or
for the work that we have done with the Atlas, because of all this I have explained, the environmentals of the poor and so on. First, it was from which year was this? From 2011 to 2015, we had the European project, which is a competitive. It's not Bezos. It's a competitive and the conditions was cooperation between civil society and academics in any topic. So we proposed this, a project called EJOT, and we got 3 million, more, less than you were mentioning, 3 million, 3 million and a half euros, which is a lot of money that we misspent, actually, a lot of it probably, but cooperating with NGOs. NGOs didn't much work because they are busy on the real life, isn't it? For them, making a map really in the realm of fiction. But it's not that they also understand, of course, they invented this idea of cartography from below, NGOs, of making visible all these conflicts, isn't it? I explained the origin of the money that we got. And then I got this ERC project, and now the Holberg Prize. One part is going to go for the others. And if we could get, well, I'm speaking strictly for myself, because the others is a collective thing. A collective meaning that there are at least 10 people involved in this, in ICTA or around ICTA, and many more outside, many collaborators. I don't know what they would think about asking money from Bezos, no? Maybe. Probably they wouldn't like it, probably. But anyway, environmental justice comes from the States, from the 80s, was linked to the idea of combating environmental racism. And there is a continuity. I think Buller got some of this money, who was one of the early authors who wrote against environmental racism and for environmental justice. And in '91, there was a meeting in Washington. I was not there. I was not invited, of people of color in Washington to establish the 17 principles of environmental justice, which I think are totally valid even today. And they talk about the whales, they talk about indigenous people, they talk about the world in general, but also about how in the States, the chemical industry tended to put their factories and so on in areas of poor people or people of color, as they call it now, or BIPOC people, which is something that they use now. BIPOC meaning Black, Indigenous, People of Color, or BIPOC. And I think that the environmental justice movement is the defense in the States and outside the States. But outside the States is not a minority, as they say in the States. I think it's a majority of the world population. If you count, well, in India, for instance, the poor people who are being really having a very bad time, being displaced from where they live, or being denied water because they are Dalits, which is something as old as the milpa in Guatemala, actually, thousands of years old, but who are being mistreated. Well, this is not a minority, it's a majority, or a large number of people in the world who are the protagonists of the environmentalists of the poor. And this links just briefly with degrowth, because for me, all these people are practicing degrowth. I call this degrowth in practice. But I think when Jason Hickel comes, you could have a discussion with him on this, because, well, he himself was born in Swaziland, and he's totally aware of the inequalities on the world. But the degrowth movement, probably in Norway or in Europe in general, is formed by young people, who I totally agree, but who think either public policies have to change, like taxes on CO2 or things like this, or also, moreover, experiments, local experiments, like, well, agroecology at home, these kind of things. Or squatting. Squatting is I recommend squatting because it saves very good metabolic and also economically if you are not expelled from squatting. Therefore, but they are very far from the geography of environmental repression around the world. And we know there are thousands of people, and the killing, these women killed, environment, they are like an iceberg of violence, displacement, and fear, I think. Most people in the world, in my view, live in fear. Fear of the authorities, fear of the police, fear of women, of men, and so on, of the rich people in the village, and so on. And this pyramid of fear really exists, well, you have to explain this and how, when they react, they don't react in a way that, like the very nice people of Lutzerat Bleibs a few weeks ago with Greta Thunberg and her friends, isn't it, in the Rhineland, or Les Soulèvements de la Terre, not right now in France. Well, these are a little bit different. They are not so young, and they are peasants, So I am in favor of social movements everywhere, on anything.
Yeah, I know you have mentioned that before, and you have also said that you don't have a strong faith in policy making from above, as you call it, it's just lobbying or something like that. And you believe, as you are saying this, in that movements from below have a potential to really push forward changes. And if we look at history, we can see that many social movements, and we can talk about women's fight for reproductive health, or workers' struggle for working conditions, have been successful in pushing governments to institutionalize changes that have really transformed the world. And in the case of climate change, my impression is, at least in Europe, and I see this from young people around me, a lot of emphasis is put on individuals as consumers and engaging in, lifestyle changes, and like eating less meat or flying less, squatting, etc. And we have a small group of activists that are engaging in more disruptive actions, like this, that throw things on paintings, or these that are puncturing the tires of SUVs all over Europe. But to me, it is undeniable that to achieve some climate goals, we need some types of institutional changes, not least of the global level. So how do you think the transformative ideas of, for instance, the growth of or environmental justice could be institutionalized?
Well, yeah,
Institutionalized.
we need some examples of climate change. I think, well, these young people in Europe and some outside, because Greta Thunberg is in Europe and Sweden, but some months ago, a girl called Disha Ravi in Bangalore in India went to the street. She must be 21, 22, with some friends, with a banner saying to the government of India, give money to the farmers, don't give money to the coal industry. The coal industry means Adani, very close friends with another company, means the National Coal Board of the state company of India. And I said 4 billion tons of coal in China. So far, only 1 billion tons of coal in India. And so this girl is totally aware of climate change. And in fact, she was accused by the police, taken to Delhi, because they intercepted some emails with northern girls in the same movement about the toolkit that they had. The police in India, these typical things of India, said, this group of people, they must be Pakistani agent with a toolkit. What is a toolkit, no? When you translate toolkit into Hindi, for instance, I don't know what word comes out, but maybe a sort of terrorist kind of explosive device. And so, therefore, all over the world, new people are starting to worry about the future, the new generations, their own generations. And climate change is not a joke, and it's increasing every year. Emissions have not yet stopped, which not against you, but complement your view about global policy making. There have been 27 COPs by now, and the killing curve keeps increasing a little bit at every COP, isn't it? And the killing curve measures the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and now is 420 parts per million, and will reach 250 in the lifetime, in 30 years' time or 25 years' time, without any doubt about it. And the COPs have, if one looks at this, have been rather useless. And the next one is going to be in Abu Dhabi, and the other one is presided by the minister, by an oil mogul. And therefore, I think that there is reason, as you said, to be skeptical of. But at the European level, for instance, the other day, 2 weeks ago, there was a meeting in Brussels about post-growth, because they didn't dare to say degrowth. But Jason Hickel was there, and Georgios Kadis, and it was organized by the European Parliament. Well, I am a European, I respect the European Parliament. Europe was much worse before 45 than it is now, and so on. But what will come out of this? Well, perhaps some policies, but the example of the circular economy shows that quite often these are words at the end. And what is reality would be also to go to India, for instance. There are many coal-fired power plants for electricity in Kanpur, in many places. In many of these places, the people complain. And the people complain because of the particles and because they get pneumoconiosis, it's called, black lung. The miners do get this, but also the people in the cities because of many. It's not the carbon dioxide, it's the other gases. And they want to stop these coal-fired power plants. And more and more often, we're seeing that local complaints use the climate change argument, a bit instrumentally, because they're more worried about the local issues. But they are learning about this, no? More than the other way around. The people who talk about climate change at the local level and think of changes in policies or taxes or carbon permits and so on, they don't know. They are not interested. There is not enough information, or the newspapers or whatever means of information. They don't talk enough about what is happening, for instance, in India. How many of you, unless you study this, know how many conflicts on coal there are today in India, isn't it? I don't know either. It could be from mines or could be from coal-fired power plants.
But I think we are almost used our time.
There is an exception. In Japan, for instance, after Fukushima, people said no nuclear power. And the government said, then coal-fired power plants, some. And a movement arose called the Kiko movement with Kimiko Hirata, who got a Goldman Prize. And of course, being Japan, all the demonstrations in the coal-fired power plant have climate change as the main argument, isn't it? So I think this is a great improvement when the global issue and the local issues come together. But the protagonists of the local issues are the ones who, in my view, have more potential politically, if they are not repressed.
We have 3 minutes again, Joan, and I just want to briefly, if you can tell me, because there's been many environmental conflicts that have ended up in courts, for instance, and thousands of environmental conflicts and movements. What has been gained by these movements, and who is winning?
Well, there was one in this country about precisely climate change, isn't it? That young people went to court already some years ago, and I think the Supreme Court did not accept this case. Well, but they gain publicity for the cause, isn't it? If you go to court, I think it's more likely that, and we see in these conflicts that there are different forms of action, from demonstrations, from writing letters, like the French peasant did before the revolution, writing to the king, and historians have profited from these cahiers de doléances, they were called, or going to court quite often, as you said, or contesting the environmental impact assessment. So there are different sort of forms of contention, of repertoires of action, as they call it in social movement theory. And I am in favor of all of them, but sometimes the courts, perhaps they are moving in some direction, perhaps depending on the countries. Yeah. And perhaps the courts are going to, the Netherlands, for instance, in the issue of climate change, perhaps they are going to make a difference. But so far, I wouldn't think that they are making a big difference. But I am in favor, yes.
Yeah. So there's a role for institutions, the state, planning.
For instance, going back to feminists to finish, and everyone in the room would have noticed the feminist movement is growing in the world for decades, isn't it? Without Politburo, without central committee, everywhere is a bit different or similar. In Iran, it's about the dress code. In Argentina, recently, abortion rights. We thought now in the States is also abortion rights, isn't it? But there are many issues for a long time, and the movement keeps, in my experience, keeps growing and growing and growing. It's not only feminists or women, it's the gender movement, isn't it? And at the end, perhaps some laws are changed. Or there is a reaction, and some people want to change the laws back. This is happening also. It's such a strong movement that there is an anti-movement, no? From Trump and from Vox in Spain, the right-wing parties, they are totally anti-feminist. And therefore, it's going well. The thing is going well in that sense. But the parliament are the last ones to do something. from the suffragettes onwards. First they had to go for such an innocent thing as voting. They had to do, I don't know, going to jail. Going to jail is a very good idea from time to time. Collectively, not individually, it's a very bad idea, but collectively, jail baro andolan, this is called in Hindi in India. It's a Gandhian thing. Fill the jails of people. You will see the state will know what to do, the judges and so on.
Okay.
But of course, it's dangerous depending on what.
John, thank you very much. We have used our time. I could have continued here for several hours talking with you. It's been a pleasure.
Because we are a bit not exactly the same line, isn't it? You are more for public policies. And you don't know where I stand, and you just know what I wanted to challenge you with. Okay. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.